I want to start with a quote. Dr. Paul Brand, he's a prominent physician, and he recalls a moment of profound teaching in his life. And he says, early in my career, I heard a lecture from the anthropologist Margaret Mead. She said, what would you say is the earliest sign of civilization? Then Margaret gave a few options. A clay pot, tools made of iron, the first domesticated plant. These are all early signs, she continued, but here is what I believe to be the evidence of the earliest true civilization. And high above her head, she held a human femur, the largest bone in the leg, and pointed to a grossly thickened area where the bone had been fractured and then solidly healed. She said such signs of healing were not found amongst the remains of the earliest, fiercest societies. In their skeletons, we find clues of violence, perhaps a rib pierced by an arrow or a skull crushed by a club. But this healed bone proves that someone must have cared for the injured person, hunted on his behalf, brought him food, and served him at personal sacrifice. The earliest, fiercest societies didn't prevent others from dying, and she didn't consider them civilizations. So perhaps she is saying that the first sign of civilization is evidence of compassion. I don't know about you, but what I'm feeling the most concern about in our world right now, in our civilization, is the seeming lack of compassion. And what I know is that when we are surrounded by people who lack compassion, most of us will begin to seek new sources of compassion or a place to belong, a place where we can be ourselves without having to defend who we are. Because if we can't find a place or a situation that treats us with compassion, what happens? Most of us will begin to wall ourselves off. You know, we talked last Sunday about the movie character Suicide or Denver, who carried a bat literally to protect himself. And I don't know that we're going to go to that degree when we don't find compassion, but we do wall ourselves off. If we're constantly being judged and measured and held to standards that don't allow for humanness, we can't settle into that sense of belonging. I remember growing up in a religion. I've talked about my upbringing many times, but I was in a religion where everyone was judged, heavily judged, harshly judged for any seeming mistake that we made. And we were judged for any slight difference or deviation beyond a very strict norm. And it was an environment that was full of public shaming and highlighted falls from grace or sin, right? I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I could not get out of there fast enough because there was no compassion. There was no room for individuality or a sense of humanity. And after that, I spent many years kind of walled off, self-protective. I was searching for compassion, and maybe some of the others of you can relate to that kind of an upbringing. But with our monthly theme being going further together, last week I shared the old African proverb that said, alone we can go faster, but together we can go further. And I think Margaret Mead would definitely agree that when we take care of each other, when we support each other, when we protect each other, when we love each other, when we sacrifice for each other, we are stronger as individuals, right? When we come together for a common purpose, on a common journey, we've created community. And with community, we can go further because compassion makes us more civilized. So my talk title today is Mind the Gap. So have any of you been to London? So when you're riding on the tube or the subway or whatever I think they call it a tube, the phrase that every single stop is, mind the gap, mind the gap. And you can buy t-shirts with that saying on it. And what they're trying to tell you is pay attention to the gap between the train car and the platform, because there's a gap there. It's very memorable and clever. But I'm going to use the phrase a little bit differently today. Today I want to use the phrase mind the gap to invite you to a spiritual practice of upon noticing anything missing in any situation, you turn within and see if it is yours to provide. So first I'm going to start with a really simple but kind of embarrassing personal example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so for many, many years, we hosted a large holiday meal at our house. And sometimes there were 50 people in a potluck at our house. And the very first year we held it, I learned an important lesson that stuck with me. The very first year, one very essential part of the meal for me was missing: jellied cranberry sauce. Okay, so I know that there are people in the room who are going to argue that homemade cranberry relish is far superior to the very divine jellied cranberry sauce. And there are other people that will argue that the cranberry sauce from a can that has the little whole berries in it, that's better too. I disagree. I really like jellied cranberry sauce. And at the first year at that potluck, I remember noticing immediately that it was missing, and I was kind of a little whiny baby about it, right? You can't have turkey and dressing without jellied cranberry sauce, right? There was a gap, and I noticed it. Well, what I learned is such an important life lesson, and it is this: if I notice a gap, perhaps it is mine to fill, right? If I'm the person complaining about the lack of cranberry sauce, perhaps I'm the person who values it the most, and perhaps I'm the person who's called to fill the gap. So for all the years following the first one, I can tell you there was jellied cranberry sauce because I provided my kind of cranberry sauce. Take note, folks. And the lesson is, mind the gap. So if I go back to my first experience, my first example about being in a religious community growing up where there was so much judgment, I noticed the gap in compassion. And what did I do? I left because of the gap. It would take me many, many years, actually, to return to those people in that community and fill the gap of compassion, bringing forgiveness and understanding and compassion that I found missing there. Because when we notice a gap, so often we leave because of it instead of minding it and filling it. You know, each one of us has a different personality, right? We have different preferences and different values. That's just what makes us unique. But yet at the deepest level, we know that we're all the same. That's what the Oneness Candle stands for, right? We share some universal needs and desires. We all share the need for a life filled with the qualities of God, all the good stuff. And what that means is every human being shares a need for peace and love and harmony and beauty and connection. We all share a need to belong, to have connection, to be visible and appreciated. We share that common need in every situation, every relationship, and in every moment. We all share that need. And I want to suggest that underneath any gap that we notice on the surface level, any gap we notice up here, the real gap is one of those shared needs. The gap we've got to mind is the gap that illustrates a lack of belonging, a lack of compassion, a lack of connection, a lack of visibility or appreciation, a lack of love, a lack of understanding, and overall a lack of oneness. Those are the gaps I'm talking about. As spiritual beings on this walk, trying to be light bringers and givers, we're called to notice any time there are those gaps, and remember that in the truth of any moment, we can bridge that gap with a recognition of the spiritual truth and an action that expresses that knowing. So I want to explain a little bit further. So I remember coaching this client several years ago, and she was upset in her marriage. And when I coach people, first thing I want to do is hear what's going on, what brought you here. And what brought her to me was a deep dissatisfaction in her relationship. And she described in just basically heartbreaking detail everything that she felt was missing in her relationship with her husband. There was no honesty. There was no affection. There was no intimacy, no support. Just those are just a few things that I remember. And she was so disappointed that she wasn't getting those things that she wanted and needed in her marriage. And so many of our early sessions were spent focused on her deep disappointment, her lack of love, and eventually she began to take a look at her own part in the relationship. And once I pointed out that the only person she could change was herself, if you've been in classes with me, you know that's one of the key things I teach. You can only change yourself. She started considering how she might change to bring healing to the marriage. Because she was dedicated. She wanted to stay in the marriage, and that's a key part. But it became clear that over time, she had slowly stopped being honest herself. She had stopped doing many of the loving things that were naturally a part of her being. And her husband, as he failed to meet her expectations, she started to wall off. She started to protect herself. And she withdrew further and further. And once we looked at that reality, it dawned on her that perhaps the gap in the relationship were partly created by her own choices, right? Perhaps the gaps in affection were because she withdrew her affection. Perhaps the silence at the table was bigger because she couldn't step into that generosity and break that silence. So I invited her to look at those gaps that she noticed in the marriage and see if she could fill them herself. And if she did this, would her marriage change? So what we did is we made a list. We actually made a list of things that she wished that she had. And then when we had that list, we made a list of how she could do something about the first list, right? What could she do? How could she step into greater honesty and vulnerability? How could she be more affectionate? How could she be more generous? How could she open up and talk more? Instead of expecting her husband to start doing anything differently, I wanted her to step into the gap herself. And over time, she began to see that she wasn't just a passenger in the relationship, and she began to change the dynamic in her home. The outcome is they're still married to this day, which is a good thing, but her filling the gap changed the trajectory of her marriage. And so often we want the other person to fill the gaps that we notice, right? But what if the other person hasn't even noticed the gap? What if the other person doesn't have the same skills that we do or level of awareness that we do? Are we going to leave because of the gap, or are we going to do everything in our power to reduce or remove the gap? It's up to us to decide, right? There is no right or wrong answer. And so we do this certainly in our intimate relationships, but it also occurs on bigger levels. It really does. In our work environments, it's easy to point out the ways that the company is not meeting the needs that we have. But it requires some ownership and dedication to offer to find ways to help meet it ourselves. In social group situations, we hope that someone else will step forward and solve the issue, right? In our families, we complain that there are these qualities missing that we desire, and we want someone else to make the first move to fix it. It's just human nature. And in the wider world, if we look around the world we live in, we're hoping that someone else will start showing more love and compassion. Or are we willing to be the source of love and compassion in the gaps that we see? If we see a gap in funding, are we willing to make the donation? If we see a gap in efficiency, are we willing to help with our own talents or time to fill that? Are we willing to step up and volunteer, right? The question becomes, who are you in the presence of a gap? What is your relationship to the gap? Do you leave when you see a gap? Or do you just point out the gap and hope that someone else will take care of it? Do you speak up about the gap? Do you step into the gap? Do you make the first move, or do you hold back, right? Life is always asking us to deliver something greater still. In the presence of a gap, perhaps we can literally mind the gap. Open up our mind to receive information and inspiration from the divine itself about the situation. Mind it. Putting spirit first and having a willingness to allow ourselves to be led and into service, we can take positive action in the situations we find ourselves in. We can create something truly extraordinary, a world that works for all, as Heather's reading was about. We're always connected to higher source, and perhaps God is wanting to show up in a situation as you. Are you the place where God shows up? Ralph Waldo Emerson was one of Ernest Holmes' great influencers, and he has this quote. He says, "The purpose of life is not to be happy. It is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived and lived well." The spiritual truth is every situation you find yourself in, you're there on purpose. So look around and wonder why you're there. Why are you there? One more story for you. One day I was on a long flight from Seattle to Atlanta. That's a long flight, y'all. It's like 5 hours. It's a long flight. And lots of interesting things seems to happen to me when I'm on flights, because you're kind of trapped in a situation with people, right? This day was no exception. So I was already sitting in my seat, and the woman came to occupy in the row with me. And once she got settled, I realized that she was, first of all, she was in a head-to-toe burqa, okay, so a whole draping outfit or clothing, and she was carrying a little baby. Now, if you travel for a living or you travel at all, the last thing you want to see come sit down next to you on a 5-hour flight is a baby, right? Period. So she started doing everything that moms do on a flight with a baby. She was bouncing the baby. She was looking in her bag. She had a pacifier. She was doing everything she could. So, I'm a nice person, so I politely asked, are you headed home, or, is this your first flight? And turns out this was her third flight today. Third flight. She said that in very halting English. She was catching a fourth flight out of Atlanta. So it was obvious from that answer, A, she was an international traveler, and 2, she was freaking exhausted, right? She was exhausted. And as we flew across the United States on that long flight, did I tell you it was long? It was a long flight. She was clutching her baby, and she kept nodding off. She kept nodding off like that. I couldn't take it anymore. My compassion just rose out of me, and my compassion as a mom and a frequent traveler, it just all took over, and I just asked her, could I help? Would she let me hold her baby so that she could get some real sleep? She hesitated, but I think she realized there wasn't really any place I could go and snatch the baby and run away. So she handed her baby to me, and she asked, would it be okay if I went to the bathroom? And I said, oh, yes, go. What would she do with a little baby in a tiny bathroom and all the burqa and all that? Like, yes, let me hold the baby. Go to the bathroom, sleep, or whatever you need to do. I had her baby. And I held that baby all the way across as this woman slept, deeply slept. There, right in front of me, was a huge gap. And compassion is what called me forward to bridge that gap and take that baby that day. And perhaps somewhere in the world, there's a mom that remembers that day, and maybe she thinks a little bit better of Americans who probably hadn't been too kind to her. I'm serious, the rest of that day, right? And as I said, the spiritual truth is you're in every situation on purpose. Look around and figure out what that might be. In your closest relationships, are there gaps that you notice but you haven't filled? In your family, are you aware of things that are missing? And if so, are you willing to talk about that and work together to kind of close that gap between what you see and what you desire? How about in your workplace? Do you see ways that you could help by contributing more or stepping into a process in a way that makes a difference to the team? How about social groups and community situations where there are gaps in key areas that you can identify? Is there a way to volunteer to close that gap, to create a better experience for everyone out of the compassion rising in you? And hey, what about right here? What about right here in our community? Maybe it's in your heart to commit to greater service or volunteering, or sometimes practicing something new around here is a little bit safer than trying to do it out there. She'll say that, right? So be visible here and know that as you grow here, you can take your skills out into the wider world. The bottom line is, in all the places where you find yourself, I invite you to mind the gap and ask your highest soul to inform you about your participation in every way. Compassion is knowing that your actions could make someone else's way a little easier, and also your way easier too. If you can be a conduit for any of the qualities of God in a situation, just let it flow. Let it flow. Be the person that other people want to travel further together with, right? So let's remember, alone we can go faster, but together we can go further. And I love this spiritual family. Let us all mind the gap. And so it is. And so it is.